So in the last video, we went through the steps required to put together an automatic wave weapon. It looked really cool, but it had some flaws, and we said that we were going to get around to fixing those at some point in time. I guess we might as well start on it now. But the way we're going to do this is we're going to break it down into building blocks and then assemble the building blocks into a really cool solution that will give us a fully automatic wave weapon that cannot be broke. Now, how was the last one broke? Well, there were two things that we pointed out at the very end of the video. The first thing was that the fire interval is not enforced, and the second is that a distribution pattern was not necessarily enforced, meaning that a player could stop firing the weapon of the ship before the entire pattern was distributed. And we need to enforce that for the wave weapon to look right. Otherwise, if you were to just tap, 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 wait a second, tap, wait a second, tap, tap, then you have random projectiles what look like kind of going all over the place. Exactly. Some of them that look kind of like stray projectiles even.
Almost, because what you would be looking at is incomplete sequences.
Exactly.
I mean, if you're fast enough, you could even have single projectiles. So it would, like you said, it would look very sporadic. You have single projectiles, you'd have parts of the sequence. It just wouldn't be as visually appealing.
So we need to enforce both the fire interval, because with the fire interval not being enforced right now, we saw that if, let's say, there was a slow fire interval and the player was hitting the fire button repeatedly really quick, we were causing fire count to be reset over and over and over, and each time fire count is reset to 0, that's the guy we're firing. And if you fire a bunch of those in a line, then all we have is a line of projectiles. That's it. So we need to make sure that fire interval is enforced so that we don't end up in that situation. So how are we going to go about putting that together? Well, in this video, we're going to focus on the creation of a burst weapon. And as I said, this is one of the building blocks in getting us to a final solution for a manageable and proper automatic wave weapon. Now, this burst weapon, what will his job be? His job will be to simply fire out a burst of projectiles and enforce that burst is fired out based off of a fire interval, and also to make sure that the fire interval is enforced. Now, this particular weapon will not extend weapon auto. There's no reason, because this is not an automatic weapon. Though it has some automatic functionality in the fact that it's got to fire off a burst of projectiles, it's not an automatic weapon. So if you were to hold the fire down, all we have is a burst of projectiles. End of story. That's it.
Exactly. You get one burst per fire press.
So let's go ahead and jump over and take a look at how we're going to pull that off. So first off, obviously the weapon's going to need to know how many projectiles are we going to fire out. So what is our total burst? So burst total. And I'm just going to say that this guy is going to be equal to 3 for my example here. And then a fire interval, because we need some sort of interval between each of these projectiles.
Because to accomplish the burst, the idea is that you initiate the burst by pressing fire. Then over time, some mechanism goes through and fires enough projectiles to meet the number given by burst total.
That's right. So what we'll do is we're simply going to create a virtual queue. Okay, this virtual queue will allow us to stack projectiles in it, and then those projectiles will simply be fired out. Ooh, okay, that sounds kind of interesting. How are we going to go about doing this? First of all, who's responsible for firing? Well, that's going to be a timer. So we will need to create a timer in this class. So I'm just going to draw the timer as a little box over here. And now let me go ahead and draw our virtual queue. Now the virtual queue is really simply going to be nothing more than a variable that is of type integer.
Exactly, and that's the idea here, is that queue very quickly suggests the idea of multiple things. The way it's actually going to be represented is with a single number, and that's where we get the term virtual queue.
That's right. So in this particular case, our virtual queue has the number 3 in it. But to visualize it, let's visualize it as a container that is currently holding 3 projectiles. Starting to see how this all works? Now here we have the timer over here, and the timer has had its interval set to the fire interval, so that each time the timer's event comes up, he's going to do what? He's going to basically visually do the following. He's going to take one of these projectiles out and fire them off. So what would we end up with a virtual queue looking like? 2 projectiles remaining, as we have a projectile on its way because it was fired off by the timer. Now, the timer is going to simply make sure when an event is fired that our queue continues to get decremented. It's going to decrement all the way down till we finally reach a point where the queue is sitting here empty. Why is this important? Simple. When the player hits the fire button, before we commit to any sort of distribution of projectiles, we can check the queue and make sure there's nothing in the queue. If the queue is empty, then what can we do? We can simply stack 3 projectiles in it, activate the timer. Why are we going to activate the timer? Well, let's think about it. Once the queue runs out of projectiles, we can stop the timer. There's no reason for the timer to keep trying to take projectiles and shooting them off. There's none left to fire. So we kill this guy off. Well, once we have reloaded, then we'll activate this guy, which means when time comes up, he'll simply take a projectile out, fire it away. In essence, he'll simply decrement this guy.
So that means that the fire interval is enforced by the fact that the weapon can only be fired when it's, you could say, empty.
That's right.
You have to wait for the weapon to finish firing, and that until finished is monitored by looking at the queue. So when your queue is empty, you're able to fire again. If you have stuff in the queue, that means you're currently in the middle of firing, and you should not allow more firing.
Now, keep this in mind as well. I'm surprised Logan hasn't jumped in and said anything yet. But as far as the order of things go, keep in mind we will fire first, and then we'll fire everything else off. For the simple fact that we saw that if we don't fire off first and we start a timer and we wait for the timer to come around and fire, that there's going to be a small amount of delay before that first projectile is fired out.
Exactly. Thus far in all of the descriptions, we've noted the timer as being the thing that grabs imaginary items out of the virtual queue and firing them like projectiles. But keep in mind that there is in fact a call to fire that happens immediately upon the button press of fire to make sure that you have that nice responsive feel to the weapon.
Exactly. Now, with this in place, we are indeed enforcing the number of projectiles we would like shot out, spaced based off of our fire interval, whatever number that may be set to. And we're also making sure that you can't sit there and hit fire, and overrun it. Okay, so we're doing a really good job at fixing the problems that we had. We'll come back to our sequence pattern in the near future. We'll get to that. We're building our way up to that. But with the solution we have right now, there's kind of a problem. I mean, one could argue that this works. But the problem comes down to timing. If I was to hit the fire button, and let's say my burst total is 3, and I fired 3 out, and I start tapping that fire button, if I don't match the fire interval dead on, then I'm going to end up with a sporadic disbursement of projectiles. So I've got 3. These guys are going to travel in a group. Now let's say a little bit of time went by, just a little bit, before it caught that next fire. So now here goes 3 again. And now let's say my timing was perfect, and I was able to catch right after that interval and fire 3 more. So now I have this group of 3 and this group of 3 looking as if it was a nice distribution of projectiles. But I've got this spacing right here. Now, timing this manually is going to be extremely difficult. So it would be nice if we could adjust our solution in such a way that if we wanted to do the old human touch of rapid fire, that we do end up with a very nice distribution of projectiles that don't have these gaps in there.
So it's almost I guess you could say the visual effect of that is as though it's smoothing your input so that your sporadic but fast enough input is smoothed into a continuous stream of projectiles.
And the way we accomplish this is quite simple. All we do is when a person hits fire, we take a look at the good old queue once again, and we make sure that the number of projectiles that are in the queue are basically less than the burst total that we have. This means that we have loaded the queue up with just 1 remaining burst, and it could be in the middle of firing off that remaining burst. As long as that's the case, then we can go ahead and stack another burst in. So let me draw 3 more in here.
So in this case, a burst is literally just 3. Imagine 3 imaginary items in our virtual queue.
Now, if I was to hit fire again, we have a number here that's going to be greater than our total burst. We're not going to stack anymore. So now you can keep hitting fire while we're waiting for the timer to fire those guys off, and we're not going to stack any more in there, so the queue is not going to get overrun with tons and tons of projectiles, and then you kick back and just use your joystick to control left and right while your ship fires for the next 20 minutes. It's not going to be like that.
Not to mention the fact that the firing mechanism could feel sluggish if you're able to greatly overrun the burst fire rate.
That's true.
And then you, at some point, for some reason, you want to stop firing in the game, you let go of fire, and your ship continues to fire for you. That would just feel kind of, it would give a sluggish feel.
Yep. So this is what we're going to be putting together using this virtual queue. Once again, it's just an integer value. While I am visually representing the queue as this little box containing projectiles, it doesn't contain anything other than a number. That number represents how many projectiles are waiting to be fired by the timer.
Exactly, because in all the places you've shown the numbers in the queue being used, you've always shown them being referencing just numbers.
That's right.
So if that's the case, we don't need to literally store a list of things. We could just store a number.
That's right, and that's all we're going to be doing here. So this is a very simple weapon to put together. So in the next video, we'll be creating the class, and we'll put it to good use. Again, we do not have our distribution pattern in place. We'll be working our way up to that, but this is the first building block. And it's another cool weapon to have on hand. So with that, that is going to wrap up this overview of the Weapon Burst class. In the next video, we shall code it. Thanks a lot, guys.